The telegram arrived on a Tuesday morning in late March of 1945, delivered by a military jeep that kicked up dust as it rolled through the gates of the ranch. Takeshi Yamamoto was in the south pasture, knee-deep in work mending a fence line that stretched toward the horizon. His hands, calloused and darkened by the Texas sun, moved with practiced efficiency as he twisted wire around wooden posts. The sky above was enormous, blue and endless, in a way that still unsettled him, even after 8 months in captivity. Everything in Texas was too big, too open, too vast for a man raised in the cramped valleys of Shizuoka Prefecture. He didn't see the jeep arrive. He didn't hear the conversation between the camp liaison officer and the ranch foreman. He only looked up when he heard boots crunching across the dry grass, approaching with a heaviness that meant official business. The translator, a Japanese-American soldier named Harry Tanaka, walked beside the liaison officer. Harry's face was carefully neutral, but his eyes carried something Takeshi recognized immediately. Pity. "Yamamoto," Harry said in Japanese, his voice soft. "You need to come with us." Takeshi set down his tools and followed without question. In captivity, you learn not to ask questions. You learn to keep your face smooth, your emotions buried, your dignity intact, even when your circumstances had stripped away everything else. They led him to the small office in the ranch house, where the foreman usually kept his paperwork. The liaison officer, a young lieutenant who looked barely old enough to shave, stood awkwardly near the door while Harry gestured for Takeshi to sit. The telegram was thin paper, already creased from being folded and unfolded. Harry handed it to him with both hands, a gesture of respect that immediately told Takeshi the news was bad. The words were in English, but Harry translated in a voice that had gone very quiet. "Your father has died. Illness, funeral held 4th of March. Family sends condolences and prayers for your safe return." The world did not stop. The clock on the wall kept ticking. Outside, cattle lowed in the distance. Somewhere in the house, a radio played country music at low volume. But for Takeshi Yamamoto, everything collapsed inward to a single point of pain so sharp it felt like his chest had been split open. His father was dead, had been dead for 3 weeks, had been buried for 3 weeks. And Takeshi had been here, on the other side of the world, twisting wire around fence posts while his father's body was prepared, while the funeral rites were performed, while his mother and sisters stood at the grave without him. In Japanese culture, the obligations between parent and child are written into the bones. You honor your parents in life, you care for them in old age, and when they die, you are there. You wash the body, you keep vigil, you light the incense, you see them into the next world with your own hands, your own prayers, your own presence. To be absent from a parent's funeral is not merely unfortunate. It is a failure so profound that it marks you, your family, your ancestors. It is a shame that cannot be washed away. Takeshi's hands began to shake. He gripped the telegram harder, crumpling the thin paper, as if somehow holding it tighter could change the words written there. His father had been 62 years old, a rice farmer with hands as tough as tree bark and a laugh that came rarely but rang loud when it did. A man who had taught Takeshi to transplant seedlings, to read the sky for rain, to bow correctly before the household shrine. A man who had wept quietly when Takeshi received his conscription notice in 1943, knowing what it meant, knowing that war had already devoured so many sons. "I'm sorry," Harry said, still in Japanese. The liaison officer shifted uncomfortably, understanding nothing but sensing everything. Takeshi nodded once. He could not speak. His throat had closed completely. He wanted to scream. He wanted to collapse. He wanted to tear at his clothes and wail as his ancestors had done, as grief demanded. But he was a prisoner of war in a foreign land, surrounded by men who had killed his countrymen and whose countrymen he had tried to kill. He was a captive, a defeated soldier, a man with no rights and no power. So he did the only thing he could. He kept his face still, folded the telegram carefully, and stood up. "Thank you for telling me," he said, his voice flat and empty. Harry looked at him for a long moment, and Takeshi saw that the translator understood the weight crushing down on him, understood what this meant in ways the American lieutenant could not, but understanding changed nothing. There were no flights home, no compassionate leave for enemy prisoners, no way to turn back time and be where he should have been. Takeshi walked back to the barracks alone. The other prisoners were still out working, scattered across the ranch on various duties. The long wooden building was empty, filled only with the scent of dust and the faint smell of the lye soap they used to wash clothes. He sat on his bunk, the telegram still clutched in his hand, and for the first time since his capture on Saipan 9 months earlier, Takeshi Yamamoto allowed himself to weep. He had not cried when the Marines overran his position. He had not cried during the interrogations, the delousing, the medical inspections that treated him like contaminated livestock. He had not cried during the long voyage across the Pacific in the hold of a Liberty ship packed with hundreds of other prisoners in darkness and stench. He had not cried when they arrived in California and he saw America for the first time, vast and untouched by war, while his homeland burned under B-29 bombers. But now, alone in the barracks with the telegram that had arrived 3 weeks too late, he cried until his ribs ached and his eyes burned. The shame was unbearable. His father had died, thinking Takeshi might never return. His mother was alone now, trying to work the rice paddies with only his younger sisters to help. The family would be marked in the village. Whispers would follow them. The eldest son, absent when his father died, captured alive instead of dying with honor, a stain on the family that would persist for generations. Takeshi did not know how long he sat there. Eventually, the sun began to sink lower, throwing long shadows across the barracks floor. He heard the other prisoners returning from work, their voices calling to each other in Japanese as they approached. He wiped his face quickly, folded the telegram, and placed it carefully in the small wooden box under his bunk where he kept his few possessions. By the time the first men entered the barracks, his face was calm again. The mask was back in place. No one asked him what had happened. Word spread quickly in the camp, passed in whispers and sidelong glances. The other prisoners gave him space, a circle of privacy built from shared understanding. They knew what it meant. Many of them carried similar fears, wondering if their own families were still alive, if letters even reached across the Pacific anymore, if they would ever see home again. That night, Takeshi could not eat. The mess hall served the usual meal, beef stew with potatoes and bread, food that would have been a feast in Japan where rationing had reduced people to eating acorns and grass. But it tasted like ashes in his mouth. He sat at the long wooden table, staring at his plate, while the noise of 100 prisoners eating and talking washed over him like water over stone. The next morning, he returned to work. There was nothing else to do. The fence line still needed mending. The cattle still needed tending. Life in captivity ground forward whether you grieved or not. Takeshi picked up his tools and walked back to the south pasture, moving like a man in a dream, going through motions that required no thought. He had been captured on Saipan in July of 1944 during the final days of the battle. His unit, part of the 43rd Division, had been ordered to hold a position near the coast. They held it for 3 days with no food, no water, and dwindling ammunition. When the Marines finally overran them, Takeshi had been too exhausted to resist. He had expected to be shot immediately. Japanese soldiers were taught that Americans took no prisoners, that capture meant torture and execution. Instead, the Marines had given him water, bandaged his wounds, and sent him to the rear with hundreds of other captives. The journey to America had been long and disorienting. First to Hawaii, where he spent 2 months in a processing camp, then to California on a transport ship, then by train across the entire continent, watching America scroll past the windows, the cities, the factories, the farmland that went on forever. He saw no bomb damage, no destroyed bridges, no starving civilians. The country was not just intact, it was thriving, producing war materials in quantities he could not comprehend. Every train that passed in the opposite direction was loaded with tanks, artillery, trucks, crates of supplies heading west toward the Pacific, toward Japan. When they arrived in Texas in August of 1944, Takeshi had been assigned to a ranch labor program. The United States needed workers. Millions of American men were in uniform overseas. Farms and ranches were desperate for hands. German and Italian prisoners had already been working in American agriculture for over a year. Now, as more Japanese prisoners arrived, they too were put to work under armed guard. Takeshi had expected cruelty, expected punishment, expected to be treated as less than human. The propaganda in Japan had been clear. Americans were demons, devils, beasts who raped and murdered, and after Pearl Harbor, after Bataan, after years of brutal island warfare, he knew Americans had every reason to hate the Japanese. But the reality was more complicated. The guards watched them closely, yes. Rifles were always present. Escape was impossible, and the few prisoners who tried were quickly caught in the vast emptiness of Texas and returned to stricter confinement. But the work itself was simply work. The cowboys who ran the ranch treated the prisoners not with kindness exactly, but with a rough fairness. If you worked hard, you were fed well. If you followed the rules, you were left alone. If you learned quickly, you were given more responsibility. The foreman, a tall rancher named Samuel Hayes, ran the operation with the same practical efficiency he applied to everything else. He had no interest in politics or ideology. He needed fences mended, cattle moved, and equipment repaired. The Japanese prisoners could do that work, so he put them to it. He was neither cruel nor particularly warm, but he was consistent and fair in ways that Takeshi came to respect. The language barrier was immense. German prisoners could sometimes communicate with Americans who spoke a little German or who shared similar root words, but Japanese and English shared nothing. Communication happened through gestures, demonstrations, and the few interpreters the army provided. Harry Tanaka, the Nisei translator, came twice a week to handle paperwork and resolve issues. Otherwise, the prisoners and cowboys developed their own pidgin of pointing, mime, and simple repeated words. Takeshi learned the English words for tools and animals: wire, post, hammer, cow, horse, water. The cowboys learned a handful of Japanese words in return, mostly numbers and directions. It was enough to work, which was all that mattered. Over the months, something like routine had developed, not comfort, but a kind of bearable rhythm. Until the telegram arrived and shattered everything. Now, standing in the south pasture 3 days after receiving the news, Takeshi worked with mechanical precision. His hands moved, but his mind was elsewhere. In Shizuoka, at his father's bedside, at the funeral he had not attended. He imagined his mother's face, carved with grief and disappointment. He imagined the village elders speaking in low voices about the son who was not there. The shame pressed down on him like a physical weight. A shadow fell across his work. Takeshi looked up to see Samuel Hayes standing a few feet away, his weathered face unreadable under the wide brim of his Stetson. The foreman studied him for a moment, then gestured toward the main house. "Come on," Hayes said, his voice gruff. "Boss wants to see you." Takeshi set down his tools and followed, his heart sinking. He assumed he was being reassigned, perhaps sent back to the main camp. Prisoners who could not work were useless. Perhaps his grief had shown more than he thought. Perhaps they thought him unstable, a security risk. They walked across the ranch yard toward the big house, a sprawling structure with a wide porch and ancient oak trees providing shade. Takeshi had never been inside. Prisoners were kept separate, housed in converted barns or temporary barracks. The main house was for the ranch owner and his family, off-limits and distant. Hayes led him up the porch steps and through the front door into a world of dark wood and comfortable furniture. The house smelled of coffee and leather. In the main room, a man rose from behind a large desk. James Thornton, the ranch owner. Everyone called him Big Jim, though Takeshi only knew him by sight. Big Jim was in his 60s, tall and broad-shouldered even in age, with steel-gray hair and eyes the color of faded denim. He looked at Takeshi for a long moment, his expression impossible to read. Harry Tanaka was already there, standing near the window. His presence meant this was official, something requiring translation. Takeshi's stomach tightened. He stood at attention, eyes forward, waiting. Big Jim spoke, his voice low and measured. Harry translated. "I heard about your father. I'm sorry for your loss." Takeshi blinked, surprised. He had not expected sympathy. He bowed slightly, acknowledging the words, not knowing what else to do. Big Jim continued. "In my life, I've learned that a man's got to honor his family. Doesn't matter what flag he served under or what uniform he wore. Some things are bigger than war." The words hung in the air. Takeshi's pulse quickened. not understanding where this was leading, but sensing something enormous shifting beneath the surface of this conversation. Big Jim reached into his desk drawer and pulled out an envelope. He held it for a moment, seeming to weigh it in his hand, then looked directly at Takeshi. "I'm going to arrange for you to go home," he said through Harry's translation, "to Japan, to bury your father proper." Takeshi's legs almost gave out. He stared at Big Jim, certain he had misunderstood, certain the translation was wrong. It was impossible. Prisoners of war did not get leave, did not get to travel home. The war was still raging. Japan and America were still killing each other across the Pacific. What Big Jim was suggesting was absurd, impossible, against every regulation and rule. But Big Jim was still talking. "It'll take some doing. Paperwork, approvals, but I've got friends in the right places, and I've been on this earth long enough to know how to push things through. You'll go under guard, official travel, and when you've done what needs doing, you'll come back and finish out your time here." He held out the envelope. Inside, Takeshi could see money, American bills, more than he had seen in his entire time as a prisoner. "This is for travel costs, expenses, whatever you need. Consider it a loan if that sits better with your pride. Pay me back after the war if you want, but right now you've got a father to bury, and no man should have to carry that shame if there's any way around it." Takeshi's vision blurred. His hands shook as he reached out and took the envelope, the paper feeling impossibly heavy. He tried to speak, but no words came. His throat had closed again, but this time not from grief, from something else entirely, something he had no name for in either Japanese or English. Big Jim nodded once, as if the matter was settled. "Hayes will work out the details with the camp commander. Harry here will help with the paperwork. You'll leave as soon as it's all arranged. Week, maybe 2. Takeshi found his voice, broken and rough. In halting English mixed with Japanese, translated by Harry, he tried to express what he felt. Gratitude, disbelief, the impossibility of what was being offered. Big Jim waved it away. "A man does what's right. That's all. Now get back to work. Those fences aren't going to mend themselves." As Takeshi walked back across the ranch yard, the envelope clutched in his hand, he felt as if he had stepped out of one world and into another. The Texas sun still beat down. The cattle still grazed in the distance, but everything had changed. A cowboy he barely knew, whose countrymen had fought his countrymen in the bloodiest war the world had ever seen, had just given him back his honor. The enormity of what Big Jim had offered did not fully register until that night, when Takeshi lay on his bunk listening to the sounds of 100 men sleeping around him. Snoring, shifting, the occasional muttered word in dreams. In the darkness, he replayed the conversation in his mind, testing it for reality, waiting to discover it had been a cruel hallucination brought on by grief. But the envelope was still there, tucked inside his shirt. The paper crinkled when he moved. It was real. What Takeshi did not yet understand was just how exceptional this moment was, not merely in his own life, but in the broader machinery of war. By the spring of 1945, the United States held approximately 5,000 Japanese prisoners of war on its soil. This number was staggeringly small compared to the hundreds of thousands of German and Italian captives who filled camps from Texas to Wisconsin, from Florida to Montana. The reason for this disparity was simple and brutal. Japanese soldiers did not surrender. The code that had been drilled into every soldier of the Imperial Army was absolute. Death before dishonor. Capture was not an option. To be taken alive was to cease being human, to become a disgrace not only to yourself, but to your family, your ancestors, your emperor. Stories circulated among American Marines in the Pacific about wounded Japanese soldiers detonating grenades rather than accept medical help, about banzai charges that were essentially mass suicide, about the 1,000-yard stare of men who had crossed some invisible line beyond fear or hope. When Japanese soldiers were captured, it was almost always because they were unconscious from wounds, too weak to resist, or so thoroughly broken by the apocalyptic conditions of Pacific Island warfare that they had simply stopped functioning. Takeshi had been among the latter. On Saipan, After 3 days without water under constant bombardment, watching his comrades die in holes blown in the earth by naval guns the size of telephone poles, he had simply stopped. When the Marines came, he did not fight. He did not reach for a weapon. He just sat there, empty, waiting for the bullet he assumed would come. The fact that the bullet did not come was his first shock. The second was that he was not alone. In the final days of the Saipan campaign, the American forces captured nearly 2,000 Japanese soldiers and civilians, an unprecedented number. Most of these men were like Takeshi, physically or mentally shattered beyond the capacity to resist. They were processed, documented, and shipped east, joining a small but growing population of Japanese prisoners scattered across the American mainland. But being a Japanese prisoner in America was fundamentally different from being a German or Italian one. The European prisoners, particularly the Germans, arrived with military discipline intact, with officers who maintained command structures even in captivity, with a cultural framework that allowed for the concept of honorable surrender. Many German soldiers had been taught that if capture was inevitable, cooperating with the Geneva Conventions was acceptable. Italian prisoners, captured by the tens of thousands in North Africa, often seemed almost relieved to be out of a war many had never wanted to fight. Japanese prisoners carried no such framework. They had crossed a line that their culture said could not be crossed. Many arrived in America in a state of profound psychological collapse, convinced they were already dead, that their families would be told they died in battle, that their names had been struck from the family registers. Some asked their captors to kill them. Others simply refused to eat, a passive form of suicide that American doctors and psychiatrists struggled to address. The language barrier compounded everything. When German prisoners arrived at camps, there were often guards or administrators who spoke some German or prisoners who spoke some English. Communication was possible. Misunderstandings could be resolved, but Japanese and English shared nothing, not a single cognate, not a grammatical structure, not even a common alphabet. The few Japanese-American translators like Harry Tanaka were spread impossibly thin across dozens of camps. Most of the time, communication happened through gesture and guesswork, creating endless opportunities for confusion, frustration, and conflict. Then there was the racial dimension, something that hung over every interaction like a poisonous fog. European prisoners, despite being enemies, were still white in a country where whiteness conferred a baseline of human recognition. Japanese prisoners were not merely enemies but racial others, targets of a propaganda campaign that had portrayed them as subhuman since Pearl Harbor. American newspapers and magazines ran cartoons depicting Japanese as vermin, as monkeys, as insects to be exterminated. The fighting in the Pacific had taken on a savagery absent from the European theater, with atrocities on both sides feeding a cycle of hatred and dehumanization. In this context, the fact that Japanese prisoners were treated according to the Geneva Conventions at all was remarkable. They were housed, fed, given medical care, and put to work under the same regulations that governed European prisoners. But the social atmosphere was different. German prisoners might joke with guards, receive packages from sympathetic locals, or even be invited to nearby churches. Japanese prisoners existed in a bubble of suspicion and careful distance. Takeshi had felt this distance from his first days in America. When the train carrying prisoners crossed the country, civilians gathered at stations to stare. Some spat. Some shouted words he did not understand, but whose meaning was clear in their tone. Guards kept the prisoners separated, both for the prisoners' protection and to prevent incidents. When they arrived at the Texas camp, the local newspaper ran a small article noting the arrival of Jap prisoners, and several townspeople wrote letters to the editor expressing concern about having enemy soldiers so close to their community. The ranch where Takeshi was assigned lay 30 miles from the nearest town, isolated enough that contact with civilians was minimal. This isolation, intended as a security measure, actually made daily life more bearable. The cowboys who worked the ranch had little interest in the politics of race or war. They cared about whether the work got done. Takeshi learned quickly that competence earned a kind of respect, or at least neutrality. The first time he successfully roped a calf that had separated from the herd, Samuel Hayes had nodded once and said, "Good," the single syllable carrying more approval than a speech. The work itself was relentless but not cruel. Takeshi and the dozen other Japanese prisoners assigned to the ranch rose before dawn, ate breakfast in the mess hall attached to their barracks, and then dispersed to various tasks under the supervision of ranch hands. Some worked in the equipment barn, maintaining tractors and trucks. Others handled the horses, mucking stalls and checking for injuries. Takeshi had been assigned to fencing and general ranch maintenance, which meant long days walking the property line, identifying breaks and weak points, making repairs. The physical labor was hard but familiar. Takeshi had grown up on a farm. He knew how to work with his hands, how to pace himself through a long day, how to ignore discomfort and fatigue. What struck him most was not the work, but the conditions under which he worked. The tools were good quality, well-maintained, plentiful. When something broke, it was replaced. When materials ran low, more were ordered. There was no improvisation with broken equipment held together with wire and prayers, no making do with worn-out tools, because replacements did not exist. And then there was the food. This was what broke through Takeshi's expectations most completely. The first meal he received as a prisoner in the processing camp in Hawaii had shocked him. Meat. Real meat, not the occasional bit of fish or the mystery protein that had composed army rations. Bread, rice, vegetables. He had assumed it was a one-time show, propaganda to demonstrate American generosity. But the next meal was the same, and the next, and every meal after that. By the regulations of the Geneva Conventions, prisoners of war were to receive the same rations as the soldiers guarding them. In America, this meant approximately 3,200 calories per day, a diet rich in protein, carbohydrates, and fats. For German and Italian prisoners accustomed to European wartime rationing, this was generous. For Japanese prisoners coming from a homeland where rice rations had been cut to starvation levels, where people boiled grass and tree bark to fill their stomachs, where children's growth was stunted by malnutrition, it was almost obscene. Takeshi gained 15 pounds in his first 3 months of captivity. His body, which had been worn to sinew and bone by combat and deprivation, began to fill out again. He could feel his strength returning, his endurance increasing, and with that physical recovery came a slow, unwilling realization. Japan was losing not just because of American military superiority, but because of something more fundamental. America had so much food that even its prisoners ate better than Japanese civilians. The numbers told a story that propaganda could not obscure. The United States produced over 300 million bushels of wheat in 1944. Japan's entire rice production had fallen to barely enough to feed its population at subsistence levels. America's cattle herds numbered over 65 million head. Japan had slaughtered most of its limited livestock early in the war to provide emergency protein. America's factories produced not only weapons, but tractors, trucks, canning equipment, refrigeration systems, everything needed to move food from farm to table efficiently. Japan's civilian infrastructure was collapsing under bombing raids, with trains destroyed, warehouses burned, distribution networks shattered. On the ranch, Takeshi saw this abundance in granular detail. The operation ran approximately 8,000 head of cattle across 30,000 acres. The foreman tracked every animal, every feed purchase, every expense and profit margin in detailed ledgers. The ranch employed 20 cowboys and now a dozen prisoners, feeding all of them 3 solid meals a day with food to spare. The scale of organization required to make this work, the systems of transportation and market and credit, represented a kind of power Takeshi had never imagined. Not military power, but economic, logistical, infrastructural power. The cowboys themselves were an education in American culture that no propaganda had prepared him for. They were not soldiers. Most were too old for the draft, in their 40s and 50s, men who had spent their entire lives working cattle in West Texas. They spoke slowly, moved with an economy of motion born from decades of practice, and possessed a competence that required no boasting. They could ride, rope, brand, castrate, doctor sick animals, repair equipment, and navigate the ranch's vast acreage without maps or markers. What struck Takeshi was their lack of hierarchy. Samuel Hayes was the foreman, yes, and his word was law on matters of ranch operations, but he did not lord his authority. He worked alongside his men, did the same hard tasks, ate the same food. When he gave orders, he explained the reasoning. When a cowboy disagreed, they discussed it. This was so foreign to Takeshi's experience that it took weeks to understand what he was seeing. In the Imperial Army, rank was absolute. Officers did not explain, subordinates did not question. The idea of a superior stopping to justify his decisions to those beneath him would have been laughable, a sign of weakness. Yet here, this loose, almost casual structure somehow produced relentless efficiency. The ranch ran smoothly. Cattle were moved, maintained, and brought to market with minimal fuss. Problems were solved as they arose through practical discussion rather than rigid adherence to procedure. It was a kind of organized chaos that should not have worked but did. The cultural gaps were everywhere, creating small moments of confusion or inadvertent offense. Japanese prisoners bowed when receiving orders, a gesture of respect so automatic they did not think about it. The cowboys found this strange, sometimes amusing, occasionally off-putting. Americans shook hands, a custom that felt oddly intimate to the prisoners, this grasping of another man's hand. Eye contact was another minefield. In Japanese culture, direct eye contact with superiors was aggressive, disrespectful. In American culture, refusing to meet someone's eyes suggested dishonesty or cowardice. Takeshi learned to navigate these differences through observation and small humiliations. He learned not to bow quite so deeply. He learned to grip hands firmly when offered. He learned to meet the foreman's eyes when receiving instructions, even though every instinct said to look down. These were tiny surrenders, small erosions of the cultural framework that had defined his entire life. Each one felt like a betrayal and a necessity in equal measure. The shame of capture never fully left him. At night, lying in his bunk, he thought of his family. His mother receiving the notification that he was missing in action, likely dead. She would have placed his photograph on the family altar, lit incense, said prayers for his soul. His name would have been mentioned in the village with sorrow and respect. A son lost to the war, one of thousands, tens of thousands. An honorable death. Except he had not died. He had surrendered, been captured, and now worked on an enemy ranch, eating 3 meals a day while his mother and sisters likely scraped by on sweet potato vines and rationed rice. The disconnect was moral agony. He was alive and healthy while his family starved. He was safe while his country burned. Every meal felt like theft. Every night of uninterrupted sleep felt like betrayal. The other prisoners carried similar burdens. They did not speak of it directly. The shame was too deep, too raw. But it hung over the barracks like smoke. Some men wrote letters home, carefully worded to pass through censors, vague about conditions, but assuring family they were alive. Most letters never received replies. The military mail system between America and Japan was nearly non-existent. The prisoners wrote anyway, sending words into a void, hoping for some kind of absolution that never came. In this context, what happened to Takeshi with his father's death was both unique and universal. Every prisoner lived with the knowledge that people were dying at home, that the war was consuming everyone they loved, but most received no news, no confirmation, nothing but silence and imagination. The telegram that found Takeshi was rare, a piece of information that had navigated the chaos of war to reach him. It had torn open a wound that most prisoners kept carefully sealed, and now Big Jim Thornton proposed to do something about it. This was so far outside the normal operations of war, so contrary to the machinery of captivity and enmity, that Takeshi still could not quite believe it. Men did not do this. Enemies did not show mercy of this magnitude. The world did not work this way. Yet the envelope remained real, tucked against his chest. The money inside was real. And slowly, as word spread, through the barracks about what Big Jim had offered, Takeshi began to understand that he was witnessing something the propaganda of both nations had insisted was impossible. That even in total war, even between races taught to see each other as subhuman, individual human beings could still choose compassion over hatred, mercy over vengeance. The arithmetic of war said this should not happen. But here in Texas, the math was being rewritten by a cowboy with gray hair and a conscience that refused to be silenced. The decision that would change Takeshi's life began 3 days earlier, in a moment Big Jim Thornton had not planned and could not have predicted. He had been walking past the prisoner barracks on his way to check on a mare about to foal when he heard something that stopped him mid-stride. A sound so raw and broken, it seemed torn from the earth itself. Someone was weeping. Big Jim was not a man given to sentiment. He had been born in 1883 on a hardscrabble ranch in West Texas, back when Comanche raids were still living memory, and a man's worth was measured in his ability to survive in a land that offered no mercy to the weak or foolish. He had built his ranch from a few hundred acres inherited from his father into one of the most successful cattle operations in 3 counties. He had weathered droughts, economic depressions, 2 world wars, and the death of his wife Martha 5 years earlier. Life had taught him to keep his emotions locked behind a wall of practicality and reserve, but that sound reached through his defenses. It was the sound of a man whose soul was breaking. Big Jim stood outside the barracks for a long moment, listening, then walked away. It was not his business. Prisoners grieved or they did not. The world kept turning either way, except he could not forget the sound. That night at dinner, eating alone in the big house that felt too large since Martha's passing, he asked Samuel Hayes about it. The foreman hesitated, then explained. One of the Japanese prisoners had received word his father died, weeks ago. The funeral had already happened. The man had not been there. "That's hard," Big Jim said quietly. "Yes, sir," Hayes replied. "Reckon it is." They ate in silence for a while. Then Big Jim asked a question that surprised himself as much as it surprised Hayes. "What do we do about it?" Hayes looked up from his plate. "Do about it? Nothing to do, Mr. Thornton. He's a prisoner. War's not over. Man's just got to carry it." Big Jim nodded slowly, but his mind was already working through the problem like a complicated bit of ranch logistics. There were always obstacles. The question was whether they were truly insurmountable or just difficult. And Big Jim Thornton had spent 62 years finding ways around difficult. He knew grief. God, did he know it? His own son, James Jr., was somewhere in the Pacific right now, serving on a destroyer in the Philippine Sea. Every day Big Jim woke up, wondering if this would be the day a telegram arrived. Every night he lay awake imagining Japanese torpedoes, kamikaze planes, all the ways the war could take his boy. The not knowing was its own kind of torture. He could not imagine knowing that someone he loved had died and being powerless to do anything about it, unable even to attend the funeral, to say goodbye, to fulfill the basic human obligations that had existed since people first started burying their dead. His wife Martha had understood this about him. She had always said that Jim's greatest strength and his greatest weakness was that he could not abide injustice, even when the injustice was none of his business, even when getting involved cost more than made sense. She had said it with affection, but also with occasional frustration when his principles created complications for their practical lives. Martha was gone now, taken by pneumonia in the winter of 1940. But Big Jim still heard her voice sometimes, asking him questions he had to answer to himself. What kind of man stands by when he has the power to ease suffering? What does it cost you to help? And if you do nothing, what does that cost your soul? The next morning, Big Jim called Harry Tanaka, the translator, and asked him to come out to the ranch. When Harry arrived, Big Jim invited him into the office and poured them both coffee. They talked for over an hour. Big Jim asked questions about Japanese culture, about family obligations, about what it meant for his son to miss his father's funeral. Harry, who had grown up in California in a Japanese-American family before the war, explained as best he could the depth of the shame, the spiritual dimensions, the social consequences that would follow the family for generations. "So this isn't just sad for him," Big Jim said slowly. "This is destroying him?" "Yes, sir," Harry replied. "From his cultural perspective, this is about as bad as it gets. He's failed in the most fundamental duty a son has." Big Jim was quiet for a long time, staring out the window at the land he had spent his life building. Finally, he said, "What would it take to get him home, to Japan, to do what needs doing?" Harry blinked. "Sir?" "Legally, practically, what would it take?" Harry set down his coffee cup carefully. "Mr. Thornton, he's a prisoner of war. We're still fighting Japan. The logistics alone would be nearly impossible. The cost would be enormous, and I'm not even sure the military would allow it." "But it's not impossible," Big Jim pressed. "Just difficult." Harry thought about it. "You'd need approval from the camp commander, probably from higher up than that, maybe the Provost Marshal General's office. You'd need a military escort, official travel orders, transportation across the Pacific. You'd need cooperation from the Japanese government, which means going through neutral channels, probably Switzerland. And you'd need money, a lot of money, for the travel, for the bribes, that would inevitably be required to push it through, for everything that would come up." "How much money?" Harry named a figure that made him wince even saying it. Several $1,000s, enough to buy a new truck or a prize bull or a year's worth of ranch supplies. Big Jim nodded slowly. "And if I provided the money?" "Then the question becomes whether the military brass will approve it. They're not obligated to. Most would probably think you're crazy. A lot of people will think you're a traitor, helping the enemy." "I'm not helping the enemy," Big Jim said quietly. "I'm helping a man bury his father." That night, Big Jim sat in his office doing calculations. The ranch was profitable, had been for years. Martha had been careful with money, and they had saved. Since her death, Big Jim had lived simply, spending little. The amount Harry mentioned was significant but not devastating. He could absorb it without endangering the ranch's operations. But could he justify it? That was the harder question. His son was out there fighting Japanese soldiers. Americans were dying every day in the Pacific. The war had cost over 100,000 American lives already. Some would say that every Japanese soldier, even a prisoner, represented the enemy, represented the people trying to kill his son. Helping one of them, spending thousands of dollars to send him home, would seem like betrayal to those who saw the world in simple terms of us versus them. Big Jim poured himself a whiskey and thought about his father, dead now 20 years. A hard man who had taught Jim to punch cattle, to read land and weather, to keep his word no matter the cost. His father had also taught him a code that went deeper than nationality or war. You treated people with respect, you kept your promises, you helped those who could not help themselves, and you never ever kicked a man when he was down. A prisoner who had just learned his father was dead and buried without him was about as down as a man could get. Big Jim made his decision sometime around midnight. Once made, he did not revisit it. He was not a man who second-guessed himself. The next morning, he called the camp commander, a Colonel Patterson whom he had met several times during the prisoner transfer arrangements. The conversation was long and, on Patterson's end, initially incredulous. "You want to do what?" Patterson said. Big Jim explained calmly, methodically. A prisoner had received news of his father's death. Japanese culture placed enormous importance on funeral attendance. Big Jim was willing to finance the trip, under full military escort and supervision. The prisoner would return after fulfilling his obligations. It would be good for morale, both for the prisoners and for demonstrating American adherence to humanitarian principles. "Mr. Thornton," Patterson said carefully, "I appreciate your compassion, but this is unprecedented. I'm not even sure I have the authority to approve it." "Then find someone who does," Big Jim replied. "I've got the money. I've got the will. I'm asking you to find the way." Patterson promised to make inquiries. Over the next week, the request moved up the chain of command, gathering attention and skepticism at each level. Some officers dismissed it as eccentric civilian interference. Others, particularly those who had dealt with Japanese prisoners and understood the unique psychological challenges they faced, saw potential value. If this worked, it would demonstrate something important about American values, about treating prisoners humanely even in the midst of total war. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A State Department official involved in prisoner exchanges suggested that allowing this could create goodwill that might facilitate future negotiations. If the story reached Japan through neutral channels, it might encourage more Japanese soldiers to surrender rather than fight to the death, potentially saving both American and Japanese lives. The propaganda value, ironically, might justify the unprecedented nature of the request. Approvals began filtering back down. Yes, with conditions. The prisoner would travel under armed escort at all times. The trip would be documented and could be used for publicity if deemed appropriate. The prisoner would sign documents promising to return. His family in Japan would be contacted through Swiss intermediaries to arrange the logistics on the other end. And Big Jim would cover all costs not absorbed by the military transport already heading to the Pacific. 2 weeks after Big Jim made his initial call, Colonel Patterson came to the ranch in person. He sat in Big Jim's office and laid out the approval documents. "I've been in the Army 30 years, Patterson said, and I've never seen anything like this. You've managed to turn the entire bureaucracy on its head." "Will it work?" Big Jim asked. "It'll work. Your prisoner leaves in 4 days. He'll fly military transport to Hawaii, then to Guam, then to Japan. The Swiss consulate is making arrangements with Japanese authorities. He'll have 72 hours in country under Swiss supervision to attend to his family obligations. Then back the same way." Big Jim nodded. "Thank you, Colonel." Patterson studied him for a moment. "Can I ask why? Really why? You could have just given him the money and let him carry the grief. Why go to all this trouble for an enemy soldier?" Big Jim was quiet for a long moment. "My son's out there, in the Pacific. If something happens to him, if he dies, I want to believe that somewhere, somehow, there's still enough humanity left in this world that people would treat his body with respect, that they'd let his family bury him proper. Maybe that's naive. Maybe I'm a fool. But I can't change what's happening to my boy. I can change what happens to this Japanese prisoner. So I'm doing what I can do." The day they told Takeshi was the day Big Jim called him into the office. Takeshi had been working when Samuel Hayes found him, and his mind immediately went to dark places. He was being sent away, being punished. Something was wrong. He followed Hayes with his heart hammering, trying to prepare himself for whatever was coming. When Big Jim offered him the trip home, offered him the money, offered him the chance to bury his father, Takeshi's first reaction was disbelief so complete he wondered if he was hallucinating. Harry translated, and Takeshi asked him to translate again, certain he had misunderstood. But the words were the same. "Go home, bury your father. Come back when it's done." Takeshi's legs gave out. He dropped to his knees on the office floor, tears streaming down his face, words pouring out in Japanese too rapid and broken for Harry to fully translate. "Thank you. How can I repay this? I do not deserve this. You have saved my family's honor. You have saved my soul." Big Jim helped him up, his weathered hands strong and steady. Through Harry, he said simply, "No man should have to carry that kind of grief alone. You do what you need to do. We'll be here when you get back." The next 4 days were a blur. Paperwork, briefings, preparations. Takeshi was measured for a proper civilian suit since he could not travel to Japan in his prisoner uniform. An Army lieutenant named Morrison was assigned as his escort, a quiet man in his 30s who spoke no Japanese but seemed decent enough. The ranch cowboys, who had heard what was happening, treated Takeshi with a new kind of respect. Several shook his hand. Samuel Hayes gave him a package of dried beef and told him to eat it on the plane. The morning of departure, Big Jim drove Takeshi and Lieutenant Morrison to the airfield himself. Before they boarded, Big Jim pulled Takeshi aside. Through Harry, who had come to see them off, he said, "You're carrying my trust with you. I know you'll honor it. Go take care of your family. Then come back and we'll finish the work we started." Takeshi bowed deeply, the formal bow reserved for the greatest respect. When he straightened, his eyes were wet but his voice was steady. In halting English, he said the words he had been practicing. "I come back, I promise. Thank you, thank you." The flight to Hawaii took 14 hours. Takeshi sat in the cargo plane surrounded by supplies and mail, Lieutenant Morrison beside him, watching America disappear beneath clouds. He had crossed this ocean once before as a prisoner in the dark hold of a ship. Now he crossed it again, still a prisoner, but carrying something else. Hope, purpose, and a debt of gratitude so profound it felt like a physical weight. In Hawaii, they transferred to another plane. then another in Guam. Each leg of the journey took him closer to home, closer to a country he had not seen in over a year, closer to a family that thought him dead. The Swiss consulate had sent word ahead. His mother knew he was coming, knew he was alive. Takeshi could not imagine what she must be feeling: joy that he lived, shame that he had been captured, confusion about how this was possible, relief that he would be there, finally, to complete the rites his father deserved. When the plane finally descended toward Japan, Takeshi pressed his face to the small window and looked down at his homeland. From the air, he could see the devastation: cities reduced to ash fields, factories burned to skeletal frames, the physical evidence of what America's industrial might had done to Japan's cities and infrastructure. And yet, somewhere down there, his family waited: his mother, his sisters, his father's grave. Lieutenant Morrison touched his shoulder and nodded toward the window. He said something Takeshi did not understand, but the tone was gentle, almost sympathetic. In that moment, Takeshi understood something he would carry for the rest of his life. The war had made nations into enemies, but individual human beings, people like Big Jim Thornton and Lieutenant Morrison, and even some of the cowboys on the ranch, could still choose to see beyond the uniforms and flags to the simple, essential humanity underneath. The plane touched down on Japanese soil, and Takeshi Yamamoto stepped out into a world transformed by loss and generosity in equal measure. He had 72 hours to do what sons had done since the beginning of time: to honor his father, to comfort his mother, to fulfill the obligations that separated humans from animals and civilization from chaos. And he had these 72 hours because a Texas cowboy had looked at the arithmetic of war and decided that some things, the things that made life worth living, could not be calculated in terms of enemy and friend, cost and benefit, victory and defeat. Some things were simply right, and right was enough. The wheels touched Japanese soil on a gray afternoon in early April of 1945, and Takeshi Yamamoto stepped off the military transport into a country he barely recognized. The airfield near Yokohama was cratered with bomb damage, hastily repaired with gravel and prayers. Buildings that had once lined the approach road were now hollow shells, their windows empty sockets staring at nothing. Smoke still rose from distant fires, the ever-present reminder that American B-29s came nearly every night now, turning Japan's cities into funeral pyres. A Swiss consulate official named Heinrich Müller waited at the edge of the runway, a thin man in a dark suit who spoke careful, formal Japanese. Beside him stood Lieutenant Morrison, who had not left Takeshi's side since Texas. And there, almost hidden behind the two officials, was a figure Takeshi had seen every day in his dreams: his mother. She was smaller than he remembered, thinner. Her hair had gone completely gray in the year since he had last seen her, and she wore the simple cotton kimono of a widow, the fabric worn and patched. When their eyes met, she covered her mouth with both hands, and the sound that came from her was something between a sob and a prayer. Takeshi moved toward her, forgetting protocol, forgetting the officials, forgetting everything but the fact that his mother was alive and here and real. He dropped to his knees in front of her and pressed his forehead to the ground in the deepest bow of respect and apology. Words tumbled out in a rush: forgiveness, shame, gratitude, love, all the things he had carried across the Pacific and could finally release. His mother knelt beside him, her hands on his shoulders, pulling him up. She was weeping, but her voice was steady as she spoke the words he needed to hear. "You have come. You are here. That is what matters. Your father waits for you to bring him home." The Swiss had arranged transportation, a battered truck that rattled and coughed but ran. They drove inland toward Shizuoka Prefecture, toward the village where Takeshi had been born and where his family had farmed rice for 6 generations. The journey took hours on roads damaged by bombing and neglect. They passed through towns that no longer existed, just rubble and a few people picking through the remains. They passed checkpoints where Japanese soldiers, gaunt and hollow-eyed, waved them through with barely a glance. The country was dying. Anyone could see it. The war was lost, even if the government refused to admit it. When they reached the village, Takeshi saw devastation of a different kind. Not bombs, but decay. Fields lay fallow because there were no men to work them and no fertilizer to feed them. Houses sagged, their wood rotting, their roofs patched with whatever material could be found. Children with swollen bellies and stick-thin limbs watched the truck pass with dull eyes. This was what total war looked like when it came home. Not the glory of propaganda posters, but starvation and slow collapse. His family's house still stood, though just barely. His two younger sisters, Keiko and Yuki, came out to meet him. They were 17 and 15 now, aged beyond their years by hardship and hunger. They bowed formally, and Takeshi saw in their faces the same thinness, the same exhaustion that marked everyone. His mother explained quietly that they had been surviving on sweet potato vines, wild plants, and the occasional bit of rice from the village's dwindling collective stores. His father had died of what the doctor called pneumonia, but what was really malnutrition, weakening a body that had worked too hard for too long. That evening, Takeshi bathed at the old wooden tub behind the house, scrubbing away the dust of travel. His mother had heated water using precious fuel, a luxury they could barely afford but insisted on for his homecoming. As he washed, Takeshi looked down at his own body and felt shame crash over him again. He had muscle, fat, health. He looked prosperous compared to his skeletal sisters. While his family starved, he had been eating steak and potatoes in Texas. The inequity was obscene. The funeral ceremony was held the next morning at the village temple. In Japanese Buddhist tradition, the initial funeral occurred immediately after death, but a memorial service at specific intervals afterward was equally important. Takeshi's arrival meant the family could hold a proper 49th day memorial, the ceremony that helped guide the deceased spirit to its final rest. The village priest, himself elderly and frail, led the service with a dignity that transcended the shabby conditions. Takeshi knelt before his father's memorial tablet, the smooth wood inscribed with his father's posthumous Buddhist name. He lit incense with trembling hands, the smoke rising in delicate threads toward the temple's rafters. He chanted the sutras he had learned as a child, his voice breaking on words that carried the weight of a year's worth of grief and guilt. His mother knelt beside him, his sisters on the other side, and together they said goodbye to the man who had held their family together. The cultural significance of Takeshi's presence transformed the ceremony. Word had spread through the village that he had returned, that he was alive, that he had somehow been permitted to come home from America to honor his father. The priest spoke of this in his remarks, saying that even in the midst of war's chaos, the bonds of family and duty could not be completely severed. The fact that Takeshi was there, against all odds and expectations, restored honor not just to him but to the entire Yamamoto family. After the service, village elders approached his mother to offer condolences they had been too uncomfortable to give before, when it seemed her son had died a shameful death in captivity. Now his presence redeemed everything. He had been captured, yes, but he had returned to fulfill his obligations. That mattered more than victory or defeat. In a world where so many sons would never come home, where so many families would never know what happened to their boys, Takeshi's return was a kind of miracle. That night, sitting with his mother and sisters around the brazier that provided their only heat, Takeshi tried to explain what had happened, how an American rancher had made this possible, how much it had cost, how he'd been treated in captivity. His mother listened in silence, her weathered face showing no judgment, only a deep weariness that came from surviving too much loss. "This man," she said finally, "this American, he must have a good heart." "Yes," Takeshi said quietly. "I think he lost someone, or fears losing someone. He understood what it meant to lose a father." His mother nodded slowly. "When the war ends, you will thank him properly. You will find a way to repay this debt." "I will spend my whole life trying," Takeshi replied. The 72 hours passed too quickly. Takeshi spent them helping his mother with repairs to the house, working in the garden to prepare what little land they could manage for planting, and simply being present. He gave his mother most of the money Big Jim had provided, keeping only enough for the return journey. It was more cash than the family had seen in months, enough to buy rice on the black market, to repair the roof, to survive a little longer. On the morning of departure, his mother pressed a small package into his hands. Inside was a carefully folded silk cloth, old and precious, embroidered with the Yamamoto family crest. "Give this to the American," she said. "Tell him we will never forget what he did. Tell him that our family's honor is his honor now." The journey back to Texas was longer than the journey out, or perhaps it just felt that way. Takeshi carried his father's memory now, properly honored and laid to rest, but he also carried a deeper understanding of what the war had done to his country. Japan was not losing. Japan had lost. The question was only how much more destruction would occur before the leadership admitted it. Lieutenant Morrison, who had maintained a respectful distance throughout the visit, spoke to Takeshi more on the return journey. Through gestures and the few words they shared, a kind of communication emerged. Morrison showed Takeshi a photograph of his own father, a man who looked like he might have been a farmer or laborer. Takeshi understood. Morrison was saying that fathers were fathers, regardless of which flag their sons fought under. Loss was universal. So was love. When they landed back in Texas in late April, Samuel Hayes was waiting at the airfield with Big Jim's truck. The foreman's gruff nod of greeting carried more warmth than a speech. On the drive back to the ranch, Hayes said only, "Glad you made it back. Got fences need mending." It was the most perfect welcome Takeshi could have imagined. Not questions or sympathy, but simple acknowledgement that he belonged here, that there was work to do, that life continued. Big Jim was in the barn when they arrived, checking on a calf that had been born sickly. He looked up as Takeshi entered, wiped his hands on his jeans, and extended one in greeting. Takeshi gripped it firmly, then bowed deeply and presented the silk cloth his mother had sent. Through Harry Tanaka, who had been called to help with the reunion, Takeshi spoke the words he had been rehearsing for days. "My mother says our family's honor is your honor. We can never repay what you did, but we will carry your name with respect for all our generations." Big Jim examined the cloth, running his rough fingers over the delicate embroidery. His eyes were wet when he looked up. "Tell your mother I was honored to help, and tell her I hope to meet her someday when this damned war is finally over." The story of what Big Jim had done spread quietly through the prisoner camp and the local community. Among the Japanese prisoners, Takeshi became something like a legend, the man who had been allowed to go home, whose honor had been restored by an enemy's generosity. It gave them hope that perhaps not all Americans were the demons propaganda had painted, that humanity could survive even in captivity. Among the local ranchers and townspeople, reactions were mixed. Some thought Big Jim was a fool, or worse, a traitor who had wasted money helping the enemy. But others, particularly those who had lost sons or feared losing them, understood. They understood that grief recognized no borders, that some obligations transcended warfare, that the code Big Jim lived by, the old frontier code of honor and direct dealing, made no exception for nationality or race. The war ended 4 months later with atomic fire and surrender. Takeshi was still in Texas when the news came through. He stood with the other prisoners in the yard, listening to Harry Tanaka translate the Emperor's radio address, the first time most of them had ever heard Hirohito's voice. The war was over, they had lost. And strangely, most of them felt not shame, but overwhelming relief. It was finally done. Repatriation took months. The logistics of returning thousands of prisoners across the Pacific was complicated by Japan's devastation and America's shifting priorities. Takeshi did not leave Texas until February of 1946. Before he went, Big Jim called him to the ranch house one final time. "I want you to have this," Big Jim said, handing Takeshi an envelope. Inside was a letter of reference, written in English, testifying to Takeshi's character and work ethic. Also inside was another, smaller envelope with money. Not a loan this time, but a gift. "For helping your family get started again," Big Jim explained, "and for keeping your promise to come back. That meant something to me." Takeshi tried to refuse the money, but Big Jim was insistent. "Use it well. Build something good. And if you ever need help, you write to me. I'll be here." They shook hands one final time, and Takeshi carried that handshake with him across the Pacific, back to a Japan that had to be completely rebuilt from ashes and defeat. The years that followed were hard but purposeful. Takeshi returned to his village and used Big Jim's money to buy seeds, tools, and fertilizer. He worked the family land with his sisters, slowly bringing the fields back to productivity. When land reform came under American occupation, breaking up the old feudal estates, the Yamamoto family was positioned to acquire more acreage. Takeshi married in 1949 a woman from a neighboring village whose own family had been devastated by the war. Together, they had 3 children and built a modest but successful farm. But Takeshi never forgot Texas. Every year on the anniversary of his father's death, he wrote a letter to Big Jim Thornton. The letters were translated by a teacher in the village who had learned English. They spoke of harvests and children, of rebuilding and hope. Big Jim wrote back, his replies growing slower as he aged but never stopping completely. The letters became a bridge between 2 men who had been enemies by circumstance but friends by choice. In 1968, Takeshi's eldest son, named Hiroshi, received a scholarship to study agricultural science at Texas A&M University. Before Hiroshi left Japan, Takeshi gave him careful instructions. "You will go to see Mr. Thornton. You will thank him for what he did for our family. You will carry our respect." Hiroshi made the journey to the ranch, now run by Big Jim's nephew, since Big Jim himself was in his 80s and mostly retired. Big Jim received the young Japanese student in the same office where he had once offered Takeshi the money to go home. Now, in a wheelchair, his hands gnarled with arthritis, Big Jim listened as Hiroshi spoke in careful English about his father's gratitude, about the silk cloth that hung in a place of honor in their home, about how the Yamamoto family had prospered, in part because of the foundation Big Jim's generosity had provided. Big Jim waved away the thanks as he always had. "Your father earned everything he got. I just did what any decent man would do." But Hiroshi pressed into his hands a package from Japan. Inside was a book, hand-bound, containing the history of the Yamamoto family written in both Japanese and English. The final chapter was titled, "The American Who Gave Us Honor." It detailed everything Big Jim had done, everything it had meant, and how that single act of compassion had rippled through generations. Big Jim Thornton died in 1971 at the age of 88. His funeral was held at the same ranch where he had spent his entire life. Ranchers came from across 3 counties to pay respects to a man who had embodied the best of the old cowboy code. During the service, the pastor read a letter that had arrived from Japan, written by Takeshi Yamamoto and translated into English by his son. The letter spoke of a debt that could never be repaid, only honored. It spoke of how a Texas cowboy had looked at an enemy prisoner and seen not a Japanese soldier, but simply a son who needed to bury his father. It spoke of how that choice had saved not just one man's honor, but had given an entire family hope during the darkest period of their history. And it spoke of how true strength was measured not in victories won, but in mercy shown, not in enemies defeated, but in humanity recognized. "In Japan," Takeshi wrote, "we have a saying, 1 kind word can warm 3 winter months.' Mr. Thornton gave me more than a kind word. He gave me my father's memory, my family's honor, and my faith that even in the worst of times human goodness survives. I will carry his name with respect until my final breath, and my children will teach their children about the cowboy who showed mercy to his enemy." The letter ended with a simple declaration. "Because of James Thornton, I learned that the distance between enemy and friend is shorter than we imagine. It is only the distance of one choice, one act of compassion, one moment when someone decides that being human matters more than being right." When the pastor finished reading, there was silence in the small ranch chapel. Then Samuel Hayes, now old himself, stood and said quietly, "That was Jim Thornton. He saw a problem, and he fixed it. He saw suffering, and he ended it. Didn't matter who or why, just mattered that it was right." Takeshi Yamamoto lived until 1993, long enough to see Japan become an economic power, long enough to see relations between America and Japan transform from wartime hatred to peaceful alliance. He credited that transformation not to politicians or treaties, but to ordinary people who had chosen humanity over hatred. People like Big Jim Thornton, People like the Cowboys who had treated prisoners with rough fairness, people on both sides who had recognized that the end of war required more than military victory. It required moral courage. His children scattered across the globe, but they all returned to Japan for his funeral. Among his possessions, carefully preserved, was the Stetson hat Big Jim had given him when he left Texas in 1946. Beside it was the letter of reference, yellowed with age but still readable. And hanging on the wall was the silk cloth his mother had sent to Big Jim, which Big Jim's family had returned after his death, with a note saying it belonged with the Yamamotos, a symbol of a bond that transcended borders and generations. The story of Takeshi Yamamoto and Big Jim Thornton became, in time, a small footnote in the larger history of World War II. But for those who knew it, the story carried a truth more powerful than the arithmetic of battles won and lost. It proved that even in total war, individual acts of compassion could crack the machinery of hatred, that a cowboy's code of honor recognized no borders, that sometimes the greatest victories were won not through force, but through the simple recognition of shared humanity. Because in the end, Big Jim Thornton had not just paid for a funeral. He had demonstrated something both nations needed to learn, that the path from enemy to friend began not with governments or treaties, but with one person looking at another and choosing to see not a uniform or a flag, but a human being in pain who deserved help. That choice, made in a Texas ranch office in 1945, echoed across decades and oceans, a quiet testament to the truth that mercy is always stronger than hatred, and compassion always outlasts war.